The night they threw her out, the temperature dropped to 12 below. She remembered that detail with the kind of precision that only comes from standing in it. The cold that didn't bite so much as erase, stripping sensation from her fingers, her face, her sense of what was real. She remembered the torchlight bleeding orange across the snow, the sound of the gates closing, iron on iron, deliberate, final, the way a man closes a ledger after writing off a debt. She remembered him standing at the top of the stone steps, Duke Aldrich Ravenhurst, 32 years old, shoulders broad enough to block the doorway, eyes the color of winter itself, not the romantic kind poets write about, but the actual thing, gray and indifferent and old. He hadn't watched her go. That was the part that cut deepest. He'd already turned away before the gates finished closing, as though the problem had been solved and he was ready for the next one. She was 18, she had nowhere to go, and she was carrying a secret that would eventually burn his entire world to the ground. She just didn't know it yet. Stay with her. You'll want to see what she becomes. The morning her father died, Selene Vale woke to the sound of her own name being spoken in a voice that didn't belong. It came through the wall of the small adjoining chamber where she slept, not the grand bedroom that was technically hers by right of her father's station, but the smaller, narrower room she'd retreated to 3 years ago when the whispers about her legitimacy had grown loud enough that occupying the main suite felt like an argument she was too tired to make. She heard her name, then silence, then the distinct and careful sound of a door being closed from the inside. She lay still for a moment, listening to the castle breathe. Ravenhurst Castle breathed differently at night. During the day it was all stone and function. Servants crossing the east corridor, horses in the lower courtyard, the administrative machinery of a ducal seat running itself with the kind of impersonal efficiency that Selene had long since stopped mistaking for warmth. But at night, the place exhaled something older. The walls were thick enough to hold 300 years of decisions made behind closed doors, and sometimes she thought she could hear them all at once. She rose, wrapped herself in the wool robe draped over the chair, and pushed open the adjoining door. Her father was already cold. Not dead yet. She would understand that distinction only later, would spend years turning it over in her mind. The gap between the moment a person stops and the moment you know they've stopped. His chest still moved. Shallow, irregular, a rhythm that had given up the pretense of purpose. His face was slack in a way she'd never seen on a living man before, as though whatever animated the specific arrangement of features she'd spent 18 years reading for approval or disappointment or the rare, careful warmth he allowed himself on good days, whatever machinery ran all of that had simply shut down. The physician was already there. She didn't know how the physician had gotten there before her. Miss Vale? He didn't look up. He was a thin man, Dr. Fenwick, with the precise economical movements of someone who had learned long ago that emotion was inefficient. You should wait outside. He's my father. Yes. He still didn't look at her. I'm aware. She didn't wait outside. What she did instead was stand at the foot of the bed and watch her father die with the particular kind of attention she'd learned to apply to everything inside these walls. Not grief, not yet, because grief requires a moment of safety, and she had not had one of those in 3 years. What she applied instead was observation, the color of his skin, the specific quality of his breathing, the empty glass on the bedside table that Fenwick, she noticed, had turned face down on the wood rather than leaving it upright. She noticed that. She didn't say anything about it. Her father died at 47 minutes past the 3rd hour of the morning. Fenwick recorded the time in his ledger without ceremony, and the sound of his pen scratching across the page was the only eulogy the room offered. Outside the window, snow was coming down in thick, unhurried curtains, the kind of snowfall that doesn't announce itself, just arrives and settles and rearranges the world while everyone is sleeping. What will happen now? She asked. Fenwick closed his ledger, looked at her for the first time. Whatever he saw in her face made something shift behind his eyes. Not sympathy exactly, more like the faint discomfort of a man who knows something that hasn't been said yet. That will be for the Duke to determine. The Duke, she repeated. Lord Ravenhurst holds authority over all estate matters pending official inheritance proceedings. He picked up his bag. I'd suggest you speak with him in the morning. She did not speak with the Duke in the morning. The Duke spoke with her. She had been in the castle for 3 years, and she had spoken directly with Aldrich Ravenhurst perhaps 11 times. She had counted them, not out of sentiment, but out of the same instinct that made her count everything. The number of guards on the east wall, the number of days between supply deliveries, the number of times the head steward, Lord Brennan, had looked at her with that particular expression that lived somewhere between contempt and calculation. She counted things because counting things gave you the shape of a situation before the situation showed you its teeth. 11 conversations in 3 years, 7 of them administrative. Her allowance, her use of the library, a misunderstanding about a horse she'd ridden without asking. 3 of them incidental, passing each other in corridors, his acknowledgement barely more than a nod, hers carefully calibrated to project neither submission nor challenge. One of them, 2 years ago, had been different. She didn't let herself think about that one very often. The morning after her father's death, a servant came to fetch her at 9 o'clock. Not the usual girl who brought her breakfast, but one of the Duke's personal household staff, a distinction that meant something inside Ravenhurst's rigid domestic hierarchy, though Selene had never been entirely sure what. She was taken to the East Study, a room she'd never entered before, a room that smelled of cedarwood and cold ash and old paper, and she was told to wait. She waited for 14 minutes before the door opened. Aldrich Ravenhurst was not physically imposing in the way that some men use their bodies, loudly, as a statement. His size was more like a geological fact. He was simply there in the way that walls are there, and the room rearranged itself around him without drama or announcement. He wore dark wool, no insignia, the kind of dress that a man chooses when he wants a conversation to be about content rather than theater. His face, as always, told her almost nothing. Almost. She'd had 3 years to study that face in the rare moments it was available to her, and what she'd learned was this. Aldrich Ravenhurst was not an unfeeling man. He was a man who had made a decision to feel things privately, and that decision had calcified over time into something that looked, to most people, like indifference. What it actually was, she suspected, though she had no proof, was a kind of long-trained self-discipline that had gotten slightly out of control. The emotion was still in there. You could see it, sometimes, in the delay before he spoke. The extra half-second where the answer was already formed, but he was choosing how much of it to give you. He sat down behind the desk. He didn't invite her to sit. She sat anyway. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite approval, but not displeasure either. "My condolences for your father," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with the flat quality of a man who'd learned that tone conveyed authority more reliably than volume. "Thank you. He was in my father's service for 20 years. He served this estate with dedication." A pause. "That is not in dispute." She heard the structure of that sentence very clearly. "But something is." He looked at her. Not through her the way so many of them did, the way that said you are not significant enough to be seen, but actually at her, with the same precision she'd been applying to him. "Your father's position was granted by my father's authority. It was not hereditary." "I know that. The question of your status within this household therefore requires clarification." "I see." She kept her hand still in her lap. She'd learned that stillness was its own kind of armor, that movement, especially nervous movement, was information she couldn't afford to give away. "And what clarification have you reached?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the grate made a low sound, the voice of burning wood, indifferent to what was being decided in front of it. "Lord Brennan has raised the matter of your birth registry," Aldrich said. "He has submitted documents to my legal administration claiming that your father and mother were never formally married under imperial charter, that your presence in this household has been a matter of the previous lord's personal generosity, not legal entitlement." Another pause. "He has recommended that this generosity be considered terminated with your father's passing." Selene looked at him for a long time. "And you," she said carefully, "what do you recommend?" "I have not yet made a determination." "That's why you've called me here. To make a determination." "To gather necessary information? Yes." "Then I'll give you some." She leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively, just enough to close the distance by one precise degree. My parents were married. I have the documentation. Not imperial charter. My father couldn't afford the charter fees at the time, but witnessed records, parish documentation, correspondence between my father and 3 members of your own legal staff confirming the arrangement. Brennan knows this. The fact that he's submitted the claim anyway tells you something about the quality of his advice. Aldrich said nothing. I'm also 18 years old, she continued. I have no income, no independent property, and no family outside of this estate. My father's service record, whatever you think of his personal circumstances, is clean. If you remove me from this household in winter, you are making a decision about whether I survive the next 3 months. I want you to be clear-eyed about that, because I think you're a man who prefers clarity to comfort, and I'd rather you make this decision fully informed than have the luxury of telling yourself later that you didn't know. Silence. The fire. Aldrich Ravenhurst looked at her with those gray eyes that held nothing back and gave nothing away, and for one long moment she almost thought, I'll review the documentation you mentioned, he said. You'll remain in your current chambers pending that review. Keep yourself available. She stood. Of course. She walked to the door, had her hand on the frame. Miss Vale. She stopped, didn't turn around. I'm sorry about your father, he said, and the way he said it that second time was different from the first. Less formal, something underneath it, something she couldn't catalog quickly enough before he spoke again. Whatever else is true. She left without answering. Masik. The review took 6 days. In those 6 days, 3 things happened that she cataloged with the same careful attention she applied to everything. First, Lord Brennan stopped meeting her eyes in the corridors. He had never been warm to her, but his previous manner had been the controlled hostility of a man who knew he held the stronger position. A kind of relaxed contempt, the cruelty of certainty. Now he looked past her. That told her the documentation review was not going Brennan's way. Second, 2 of the kitchen maids who had previously treated her with the reflexive social calculation of people determining which side of a boundary she stood on began leaving her meals outside her door rather than sending the usual servant. A small thing, but small things were how large things announced themselves. Third, she found her father's hidden room. She hadn't known it existed. In 3 years of living in the guest wing allocated to her father's staff position, she had never found it because her father had been meticulous and private, and because she hadn't been looking. She found it on the 4th day after his death, when she was going through his formal study, permitted to her for 30 minutes a day by a note from Aldrich's household manager, and she pressed her weight against the wrong section of the bookcase while reaching for a volume on the upper shelf. The panel gave inward by 3 inches. She stood very still for a moment, listening to the corridor outside, then pushed it the rest of the way. It was not a large space, more of a deep alcove that had been converted. A narrow desk, an oil lamp, a locked chest bolted to the wall. The kind of thing a man builds when he has information that would get him killed if it were found. She had no key to the chest. What she did have was what was beneath the desk, not locked, not hidden, just placed where the shadow fell deepest, under the overhang of the single narrow drawer. A folded letter, old enough that the paper had gone soft at the creases, sealed originally with wax that had long since been broken and resealed 3 times with a different wax. Her father's handwriting on the outside. For Selene, if I am gone before you find this, then they have moved faster than I expected. Read it alone. Read it once. Then you will need to decide what kind of person you are going to become. She read it alone. She read it once. It took her approximately 7 minutes to understand what her father had been carrying for the last decade of his life, and approximately another 3 minutes to understand why understanding it made her the most dangerous person in Ravenhurst Castle, and possibly the most dangerous person in the Empire. She folded the letter, placed it inside her boot, left the hidden room, closed the panel behind her. She went back to her chambers and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the opposite wall for a very long time. The letter said that 18 years ago, in the 4th year of the current emperor's reign, a man had been murdered in the capital city. The murder had been arranged to look like fever. The man's name was Lord Cassius Vale, her father's older brother, a court official of middle rank, unremarkable in every way except one. He had been the last surviving keeper of the imperial genealogy records for the Aurelius line, the original bloodline from which the empire's right of rule had descended for 200 years. Before he died, Cassius Vale had transferred those records to his brother, her father. Her father had spent the next 18 years in Ravenhurst's service, not out of loyalty to the Duke's house, not out of choice, but because Ravenhurst territory was the one corner of the empire where the current emperor's intelligence apparatus had the weakest reach. Her father had hidden among the provincial machinery of a northern ducal estate and waited, and kept his mouth shut, and watched his daughter grow up not knowing any of it. The letter said the records proved something that, if it became known, would invalidate the current imperial line entirely. It said the proof was in the locked chest. It said the key was sewn into the lining of his formal dress coat, the one he wore on official occasions, the one currently hanging in the wardrobe in his locked chambers. It also said, "They know I have the records. They don't know where they are yet. If I'm dead when you find this, you have perhaps 2 weeks before someone inside this castle gives them what they need to find the chest. The physician works for them. So does one other person you would not expect. Don't trust the obvious enemies. The one who will destroy you has been watching you with something that looks like contempt but isn't." She read that last line 3 times. The one who will destroy you has been watching you with something that looks like contempt but isn't. On the 6th day, Aldrich Ravenhurst called her back to the east study. The fire was burning lower this time, the room a degree colder, the light more diffuse. He was standing rather than sitting, which was a change she registered and filed away. He held a sheaf of papers in one hand, not holding them up, not presenting them, just carrying them at his side the way a man carries something he's already decided about. "I've completed my review," he said. "I see that. Lord Brennan's submission was not legally sustainable. Your parents' marriage, while informally documented, meets the threshold for recognized union under provincial statute." He set the papers on the desk. His recommendation was therefore invalid. She waited. However, he crossed to the window, stood with his back to her for a moment. The view was the north courtyard, gray stone and gray sky, and the persistent snow that hadn't let up in a week. "The matter of your status going forward is not resolved by the marriage question alone. You are a dependent of this estate without an independent legal claim to residency. That is technically a separate issue." "You're going to ask me to leave," she said. "I'm explaining the legal landscape." He turned from the window. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not the calculated blankness she'd catalogued, but something more effortful, something that looked like a man pushing against his own current. There are pressures being applied to this administration, from several directions simultaneously. The marriage documentation settles Brennan's specific challenge, but it doesn't... He stopped. Started again. "It doesn't eliminate the larger difficulties surrounding your presence here." "What pressures?" She kept her voice level. "Specific pressures from specific sources." He looked at her. "That's not information I'm prepared to share. You're asking me to accept a decision that affects my survival without telling me why. I'm not asking you to accept anything yet. You called me here," she said quietly. "You don't call someone here to explain legal nuance as a kindness. You call them here because you've made a decision and you need to look them in the face when you deliver it." She stood. Not from agitation, from the understanding that she needed to meet whatever came next on her feet rather than in a chair. "What have you decided?" The silence in the room was different from the others she'd sat through with him. Those silences had felt like deliberation, like a careful man taking his time with precision. This one felt like something else, like something already finished, and the man in front of her catching up to the fact of it. "I think you should leave Ravenhurst," he said. She said nothing. "Not as a formal expulsion, not on the grounds Brennan claimed, but I think, under the current circumstances, your position here is untenable in ways that I cannot fully explain to you, and that you would be better served by removing yourself from." He wasn't looking away. She'd expected him to look away. "I can provide a settlement, money, a letter of reference, transport to whatever destination you choose. You would not leave here without resources." "You're offering me money," she said. "I'm offering you a way out of a situation that you created." She took one step toward him, Just one, because anything more would have been theater, and she didn't have room in her right now for theater. Lord Brennan serves this estate at your pleasure. Whatever legal challenge he mounted because someone allowed him to. The pressures you're describing, the ones you won't name, are pressures on your administration, and you are resolving them by removing me. She held his gaze. Call it what it is. Something moved across his face. Genuine pain. Not guilt exactly, but its older, more complicated cousin. The emotion of a man who has decided something for reasons he believes are sound and is currently experiencing the cost of that decision in real time. Call it what you want, he said quietly. The offer stands. I don't want your money. Then what do you want? I want to know why, she said. Not the legal explanation, not the political landscape. Why? You are not a man who does things arbitrarily. You reviewed my documentation and found it legitimate, and you're still asking me to leave. There is a reason that has nothing to do with Brennan's paperwork, and I want to hear it from you. He was quiet for a long time. The fire settled. Something in the grate collapsed into itself with a soft, definitive sound. Because I believe, Aldrich said, that staying here is more dangerous for you than leaving, and I cannot tell you why without making it more dangerous still. She stared at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without qualifying, without retreating into the official version of himself. Just looked at her, and the look said, This is real, and I'm sorry, and I cannot explain it, and I need you to leave. For one moment, one precise, unguarded moment, she almost believed him. Then she thought of the letter in her boot, the physician who worked for them, the one who would destroy her watching her with something that looked like contempt but wasn't. She thought of Aldrich Ravenhurst turning to look at her in corridors with those gray eyes that gave nothing away, that she'd always read as dismissal, that her father had warned her about in a letter he'd written, knowing he was probably already dying. The one who will destroy you has been watching you with something that looks like contempt but isn't. She picked up her cloak from the chair where she'd left it. I'll need until tomorrow morning to gather my things, she said. Of course. His voice was carefully neutral again, back inside himself. I'll have transport arranged. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, didn't turn around this time either. My father trusted you, she said. Whatever you think of me, whatever you've decided, I want you to know that he trusted you specifically. Out of everyone in this empire, he chose to be here, in this house. She left before he could answer. She did not sleep that night. She spent the first 2 hours in her father's locked chambers, working the seam of the formal coat with a needle she'd taken from the mending basket in the servants' hall. The key was where the letter said it would be. Small, iron, slightly tarnished, the kind of key that looks like it belongs to nothing important. She put it around her neck on the cord she cut from the coat's own lining. She spent the next 3 hours in the hidden room. The chest opened on the second try. Inside were documents she didn't fully understand yet. Not enough time, not enough context, but she understood enough. Her father's handwriting on the cover page of the primary document, dated 18 years ago, annotated in the margins in a hand she didn't recognize. Seals she'd never seen. A genealogical chart that ran back 240 years and ended, impossibly, with a name she recognized. Her mother's name. Her mother, who had died when Selene was 4. Her mother, whose family she'd never been told about. Whose history her father had deflected every time she'd asked, gently but consistently. With the particular deflection of a man protecting something by keeping you ignorant of it. Her mother, whose full name she had never known until this moment, because her father had always simply called her your mother, and Selene had assumed that was grief, that grief sometimes strips the names off people to make them bearable. She sat in the hidden room with the documents in her lap and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just had the ground removed from beneath them, that she had not known the most basic facts of her own existence. She wrapped the documents in oilcloth from the bottom of the chest, put them inside the lining of her travel bag between the outer leather and the inner wool, in the same place where her father had hidden his key. She replaced everything in the chest that she wasn't taking. She locked it. She closed the panel. She went back to her chambers and packed what she owned, which was unmuch. 2 dresses, a wool coat, books she couldn't carry and would have to leave, the small painted miniature of her mother that she'd kept on her bedside table for 14 years, and had never thought to look at the back of until tonight, until after she'd seen her mother's name in the genealogical record, and found written on the back in faded ink what had been there all along. Alara Aurelius Vale, the last. She held the miniature for a long time in the candlelight, her mother's face looking back at her, the face she'd always been told she didn't resemble, the face that noble guests had sometimes studied with a strange expression she'd never been able to decode. Looked different now. Looked like evidence. She put it in her coat pocket, blew out the candle, sat in the dark. What? They came for her at midnight. Not the Duke's men. She was certain of that. Later, in the years she spent turning over every detail of that night. Not Aldrich's household, not his guard, not anyone with official sanction. 3 men in unmarked dark wool who came through the servants' entrance on the north side of the building, the entrance she'd noted 3 years ago as the least observed because it opened into the delivery corridor, used only twice a week. She heard them because she'd spent 3 years learning what this castle sounded like when it breathed normally. And what she heard at 12 past midnight was wrong. Not loud wrong, just wrong. A door that should have been latched opening without the characteristic drag of the swollen wood at the bottom. Footsteps that understood how to be quiet in a way that servants don't learn and guests don't need. She was already dressed, bag already packed. She went out the window. Not dramatically. The window in her chamber was low, the drop to the kitchen garden no more than 8 feet, and she'd imagined doing it enough times in the past 3 years that the mechanics were already solved. She went out feet first, hung from the sill for one breath, let go. The snow took the impact without noise. She pressed against the outer wall, listening. Inside, movement. The sound of a door opening, her door. She didn't wait to hear what happened next. She moved. The east postern gate was unguarded at this hour on most nights. She'd confirmed this twice in the past year during the sleepless stretches that had been her version of rest since her father's health began declining. Tonight, it was unguarded again, or almost. One man, her father's old doorward, half asleep in the guardhouse, who saw her cross the 30 feet of open ground and did not move, did not call out, did not do anything except look at her with the expression of a man who has decided that seeing nothing is the only form of help he's permitted to give. She stopped at the gate, looked back at him. He dropped his eyes to his boots. She pulled the gate open and walked out into the snow. Oh, I get. The cold hit her like a physical fact. Not dramatic, not operatic, just the empirical reality of 12-degree air against skin and wool, and the thin soles of boots that were made for interior stone rather than open terrain. The world beyond the postern gate was a white field sloping down toward the tree line 200 yards south, the trees themselves black against a sky that was the same dark gray as exhausted iron, the snow still coming down in the same unhurried curtains it had been laying down for a week. She had enough money for perhaps 6 weeks of modest living if she was careful. She had documents that, depending on who saw them and when, were either meaningless or incendiary. She had the name written on the back of a painted miniature and a letter from a dead man who had trusted her with the most dangerous knowledge in the empire and then left her alone with it. She had her own 2 feet. She started walking toward the tree line and didn't look back at the castle. Didn't look back at the walls, didn't look back at the windows, didn't perform any of the theatrical gestures of departure that circumstances seemed to call for. She looked ahead, at the trees, at the specific distance between where she was and where the darkness would cover her. 50 yards. She heard the gates open behind her, not the postern gate, the main gates, the large iron gates on the north face that she'd heard closing in her future memory since the moment she woke up that morning and found her father's chest still. The gates that meant something official, something decided, something being enacted with the full weight of the ducal seal behind it. She didn't stop walking. A voice called her name across the snow. Not one of the midnight men. They were inside still, or dealt with, or gone. This was a different voice, one she knew, one she had been cataloging for 3 years in all its registers from administrative to incidental to that one time 2 years ago that she tried not to think about. Aldrich Ravenhurst's voice, carrying across 50 yards of open winter, said her name the way a man says something that costs him. She stopped. She stood in the snow with her back to him, and the tree line 30 yards ahead, and her mother's painted face in her coat pocket, and the documents against her ribs inside the lining of her bag. And she waited. His footsteps in the snow were unhurried, no urgency in the pace, not running, not even rushing, just walking toward her with the steady directional certainty of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it regardless of what it costs. She heard him stop a few feet behind her. "You were going to leave without—" He stopped, reconsidered. "There were men in your chambers tonight." "I know. They weren't mine." "I know that too." A silence. Wind moving through the distant trees, the snow making its soft, indifferent sound. Selene. Her given name. He'd never used it before. Not once in 11 conversations. Not once in 3 years. Always Miss Vale or nothing at all. The sound of it in his voice was strange. Like a word in a language that she knew the meaning of, but had never heard spoken aloud. "If you walk into those trees tonight, I can't protect you. Not from what's coming, not from the people who sent those men." She turned around. He was standing 6 feet behind her, coat open to the cold, no hat, snow on his shoulders and in his hair. His face was doing the thing again. The thing she'd seen for the first time in the East study when he told her to leave. The effortful thing, the thing underneath the practiced control. Except worse now, more exposed, because there was nobody else watching and the dark stripped the performance value out of anything. "You had 6 days, she said. 6 days to tell me that I was in danger. 6 days to tell me whatever you know about my father's death. You used those 6 days to arrange a settlement and a letter of reference and a ride to wherever I chose to go." She held his gaze. Her voice was steady. She needed it steady. "And now you're standing in the snow calling me by my first name and telling me you can't protect me if I leave. So I need you to explain something to me very clearly." "Selene, why did you wait?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Not from grief, from anger, the specific cold fury of someone who has found out that a person in a position to help them made a calculated choice not to. "My father trusted this place. He trusted you, specifically, and they murdered him here, inside your walls, and you had 6 days and you spent them on legal reviews and settlements. Why?" His jaw was tight, eyes steady. In the snow, in the dark, without the architecture of the East study around him, he looked like a different person, or maybe like the same person with less distance between himself and the surface. "Because knowing the truth would have put you in more danger," he said, "not less. That wasn't your decision to make. It was exactly my decision to make." His voice had dropped, the control still there but different now. Not cool, not administrative, but effortful in the way that cold things are effortful to hold. "I have been managing the information around your father's situation for 2 years, not because it benefited me, because the people who want what he was keeping are capable of things that would—" He stopped, started again. "I made the decision I made because I believed your best chance was to be out of this before anyone understood what he'd passed on to you." The night went very quiet. Selene looked at him. She looked at him with the careful attention she'd been applying to this man for 3 years. All her catalogued observations, all her filed reactions, the 11 conversations and everything she'd read between the lines of them, and everything her father's letter had suggested, and everything the documents in her bag had revealed, and everything she'd been unable to decode and had attributed to contempt, to dismissal, to the simple indifference of a powerful man to someone he considered beneath his notice. She looked at him and she thought, "The one who will destroy you has been watching you with something that looks like contempt but isn't." "You know," she said slowly, "what my father was keeping, what it means. You know." He said nothing, but the silence confirmed everything. She felt the cold then, really felt it, the 12 degrees and the wind and the snow on her face, because the last of the adrenaline had burned through and what was left was the raw, exposed nerve of understanding how badly she had miscalculated. Not about the documents, not about her own safety, about him. She thought she'd been building a profile of a cold man. She'd been building a profile of a frightened one. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since before your father came to this estate," Aldrich said. "Since before you were born." The snow came down between them. 30 yards behind her, the tree line waited. 6 feet in front of her, the Duke of Ravenhurst stood in the cold without his coat buttoned, snow on his shoulders, looking at her with eyes that finally held nothing back. No calculation, no practiced distance, just the full weight of whatever this man had been carrying for 18 years in the space behind those gray eyes. Looking at her like someone who has been waiting, against all reason and all odds, for exactly this moment, and now that it has arrived, does not know whether it is the beginning of something or the end. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something in those records I don't think your father told you. Something that changes everything you think you know about why you're standing here." Selene's hand closed around the documents inside her bag. "Tell me," she said. "Not here." His eyes moved past her to the dark tree line, then back. The urgency she'd heard in her name across 50 yards of open snow was in his face now, fully visible, undisguised. "If they realize you found the chest, we have until dawn. Maybe less." "Tell me now," she said. "Right here. Because I am not walking one more step in any direction, not into those trees, not back into that castle, until I know what it is." A long moment. He looked at her, and then Duke Aldrich Ravenhurst, the man who had thrown her out of the only home she'd known in the hardest winter in decades. The man she had hated with the quiet, sustainable hatred of someone who survives on it. The man her father had trusted and she had spent 3 years cataloging from a careful distance. He opened his mouth and told her the one thing that shattered every version of her own history she had ever believed. He said it in 11 words. 11 words standing in the snow outside the postern gate, with the castle at his back and the dark tree line 30 yards behind her, and the cold doing what cold does, stripping away everything that wasn't essential, leaving only the raw architecture of the moment. "Your mother was not the last of the Aurelius line," he said. "You have a sister." Selene stood very still. The snow came down between them, indifferent, continuous, laying itself across the ground with the patience of something that has no interest in human timing. "That's not possible," she said. "My mother died when I was 4. There was no—" "Your mother survived the attempt on her life," Aldrich said. "What she didn't survive was the decision she made afterward. She gave the younger child to someone outside the Empire and let everyone believe the fever had taken both of them." His voice was stripped down, no official register, no distance, just the flat delivery of a man reciting facts he has carried too long in a body not designed for the weight. "Your father knew. He agreed to it. Keeping them separate was the only way to ensure that if one was found, the other still existed." She heard her own breathing, slow, deliberate, the thing her body did when the alternative was coming apart. "How long have you known this?" "I told you, since before you were born." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have tonight." He looked past her at the trees, then back. "Selene, we need to move." "You don't get to call me that and then tell me we need to move." She took one step toward him, not threatening, just closing the gap so there was no comfortable distance left for him to hide behind. "You have been holding this information for 18 years. My father is dead. My mother's entire history has been a lie I was raised inside of. You stood in that study 6 days ago and told me my best option was a settlement and a letter of reference." Her voice didn't rise. Staying level was the only weapon she had left, and she used it with both hands. "You're going to stand here in this cold, and you are going to tell me why." He looked at her for a long moment. "Because the moment you know everything," he said, "you become the most dangerous person in this empire. And every dangerous person in this empire immediately becomes your problem." Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a man who has been right about something terrible for a very long time. "I was trying to give you one more day of not being that." The wind moved through the distant trees with a low, continuous sound. She understood, standing there, that she had 2 choices. She could spend the next hour extracting every remaining fact from this man in the snow outside a castle where 3 armed men had just entered her chambers in the dark. Or she could accept that the full shape of what she'd walked into tonight would not fit inside a single conversation, and make the decision that kept her alive long enough to have the rest of it. She was 18 years old. She had nowhere to go. She had a dead father and a mother she'd been told was dead, and a sister she hadn't known existed, and documents in her bag that could invalidate the current imperial line and men with knives already inside the walls. She picked up her bag. "Then stop giving me days I didn't ask for," she said, "and start giving me what I actually need." Which is? A direction, and a reason to walk in it instead of through you. Something shifted in his face, not quite the ghost of what might have been a different expression under different circumstances, but the shadow of one. South Gate. There's a horse already saddled in the lower stable. The man holding it owes me a debt he hasn't finished paying. He reached inside his coat and held out a folded paper. The address in the capital. Use it when you're ready, not before. She took the paper, didn't look at it. Aldrich. He stopped. "When I come back," she said, "and I will come back, I'm going to need you to decide before that moment arrives which side of this you're actually on, because I will not give you a third conversation to figure it out." She turned and walked toward the trees. He didn't call after her. She did not look back. That was the first decision she made, and what she would later understand was the new version of her life. Not the dramatic kind of decision that announces itself, but the small structural kind, the kind that sets the load-bearing walls. She did not look back at the castle. She did not let herself stand at the tree line and take one last look at the place where her father had died, and where she had spent 3 years building a careful, detailed map of her own irrelevance. She walked into the trees, and the dark took her, and she was gone. 5 years. The capital city of Wehrmacht, in the 47th year of Emperor Callius II, was not a city that had a memory for people who didn't want to be remembered. It was a city of 200,000 ambitions, running at full speed in every direction simultaneously, the kind of place where fortunes were made and erased between breakfast and supper, where the social cartography shifted fast enough that last year's scandal was this year's dinner guest, and nobody had the time or the interest to track the trajectory of a provincial girl who had walked out of a northern estate during a bad winter and disappeared. Nobody looked for her initially because she had nothing. Nothing was, it turned out, excellent cover. She arrived in the capital with the money from Aldrich's settlement. She had taken it, after all, standing at the tree line, making the pragmatic calculation that principles were for people who could afford them, and a set of documents she didn't fully understand yet, and a name she couldn't use. She found a room in the lower merchant district, 8 feet by 10 feet, with a window that faced an alley and a landlord who asked no questions because she'd paid 3 months in advance, and cash had its own eloquence. She spent the first 6 months learning. Not studying, learning, which is a different thing. Studying is what you do when someone has organized the information for you, and your job is to absorb it in the correct sequence. Learning is what you do when the information is raw and dangerous and scattered across a city that will take from you whatever you cannot protect, and your job is to construct the map yourself out of fragments and instinct, and the particular discipline of someone who has understood at a cellular level that ignorance is not a condition you are entitled to remedy slowly. She learned the financial architecture of the empire first, because money was the language the people who had killed her father spoke fluently, and she needed to speak it before she could understand what they were saying. She learned it from books initially, then from the men and women who actually operated it, the money changers in the merchant quarter, the commodity brokers along the river docks, a retired finance minister's assistant named Corvus Meln, who gave her a job doing accounts for a trading house because she could calculate faster than anyone he'd interviewed, and he didn't care where she'd come from as long as the numbers were right. Corvus Meln was 57 years old and had no patience for inefficiency and an unexpected tolerance for people who asked uncomfortable questions. He was also, she discovered in her second year working for him, one of 7 people in the empire who had been aware of her father's activities and had chosen to take no action, not out of loyalty to the existing power structure, but out of a cool, privately held conviction that the right moment had not yet arrived. He recognized her on a Tuesday morning in November of her second year in the capital, looking at her across a column of figures she'd just corrected, with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to walk through a specific door and has just realized it's actually happened. "You have your mother's forehead," he said. She put down the pen. "How long have you known?" "Since about 3 weeks after you started. Long enough to decide it was worth waiting to see what you were going to become before I said anything." He folded his hands on the desk. "Well, what are you going to become?" I haven't decided yet, she said. I'm still gathering information. He looked at her for a long moment, then let me help you gather it faster. She became Lady Seraphina Ashbourne in the 4th year. Not a disguise, exactly. She had learned in 3 years of careful construction that the most durable transformations are the ones built from the inside out, rather than the outside in. Seraphina Ashbourne was not a mask she put on. She was the person Selene Vale had been becoming through 3 years of deliberate, methodical reconstruction. The girl who had walked out of Ravenhurst with nothing learning how to occupy space differently, how to move through a room without asking permission with her posture, how to deliver silence as a weapon rather than an apology. The fortune was real. That was important. There was no aristocracy of illusion in a city that had been separating genuine wealth from its performance since before she was born. The trading house had been the foundation. Corvus's patient instruction and her own furious capacity for work, 18-hour days, and a talent for reading where capital was going before it went there. The network she built on top of it was more complicated and more careful. 7 people across 5 districts of the empire, each holding one piece of information that mattered, none of them holding enough to be useful to anyone except her. She had been back to the north twice, moving under different names, confirming what she needed to confirm. She had located one of the 3 men who had entered her chambers the night she left, found him running a protection arrangement out of a transport company in a western port city, fat and comfortable, and entirely unprepared for the particular quality of attention she had developed for men who thought they were no longer findable. She had not confronted him, not yet. She needed the chain, not the link. She had also, on the second northern trip, stood outside the walls of Ravenhurst Castle on a cold October afternoon and watched the household go about its business for 4 hours from a distance, and confirmed that Aldrich Ravenhurst was still there, still alive, still running the estate with the same impersonal efficiency she'd spent 3 years cataloging from the inside. She had not contacted him. She had not used the address on the paper he'd given her in the snow. She had kept the paper. Igietispas. The imperial capital in early spring of the 47th year was running at a particular fever pitch, the kind that precedes a succession crisis, a low-grade political heat that everyone could feel and nobody wanted to be the first to name. Emperor Caelius II was 63 and had not been seen in public in 4 months. His eldest son, Crown Prince Dorian, had been consolidating relationships with the senior nobility at a pace that seasoned political observers described, with careful neutrality, as energetic. His younger brother, Prince Hadrian, had stopped attending council sessions and had taken to spending extended periods at his northern estates. Selene, Seraphina, in this city, in this coat, with this face that she'd learned to wear so completely that she sometimes had to remind herself it was a face she'd put on rather than grown into. Watched all of this with the attention of someone who understands that political heat is not a metaphor, but a literal property of certain moments in history, the kind that burns clean through whatever is not solid. She was here for one reason, layered into several. The surface reason. Lady Seraphina Ashbourne, 23 years old, recently arrived from the Eastern Territories with enough capital to make every significant trading house in the capital interested in her business, and enough social intelligence to make every significant noble family interested in her connection. The invitations had started arriving within a week of her establishment in the capital's upper merchant district. She had accepted exactly half of them, the half chosen by a calculation that had nothing to do with social advancement. The actual reason? Somewhere in the capital's administrative archive, in the section that governed imperial succession law, were the records that had been altered 18 years ago to place the wrong bloodline on the throne. Her father had held the proof of the original. What she needed was the evidence of the alteration, the specific mechanism by which the fraud had been executed, and the names of the people who had executed it. Those names were the ones that mattered. The documentation was the sword. The names were the hand on the grip. She was 3 months into this stage of the work when she attended the spring reception at the estate of Duke Fenmore Calloway, the most influential non-royal peer in the capital, a man whose social gatherings were essentially policy meetings conducted with better wine, and saw, across the width of a room full of people performing their importance at one another, the face she had been avoiding for 5 years. Aldrich Ravenhurst. He was standing near the east window with two other men she didn't recognize, holding a glass he hadn't touched, wearing the same kind of dark, understated wool she remembered, and looking at the room with the same quality of contained attention she had spent 3 years learning the shape of from close range. He hadn't seen her yet. She had approximately 12 seconds before the angle shifted, and he would. She spent 11 of them making a decision she'd been theoretically making for 5 years, but had never had to make in real time with real stakes and 30 feet of ballroom floor between them. On the 12th second, she turned to the man on her left, Lord Hanneth, who had been attempting to discuss commodity investments for the past 4 minutes, and said something that made him laugh. And in the peripheral vision, she watched Aldrich Ravenhurst's gaze reach the point where she was standing, and stop. She did not look at him. She gave it 30 more seconds, enough time for him to process what he was seeing, to do the same recalibration she had done at 12 seconds and reach his own conclusion. Then she excused herself from Lord Hanneth and walked in the direction of the West Terrace, slowly, without looking back. She was 3 steps onto the terrace before she heard him behind her. "I wasn't sure," he said, "for about 20 seconds, and then I was." She turned. He looked the same, older. The gray in his hair had extended its reach. The lines around his eyes had deepened from the cold and from whatever the past 5 years had required of him. But the essential quality of him was unchanged. That contained, costly attention, the feeling of being looked at by someone who has made a lifetime practice of seeing things accurately, and it has not made him happy. "Lady Ashbourne," she said. "Seraphina." He said the name like he was testing the weight of it. "It suits you." "Most people think so." A pause. The terrace was empty, the noise of the reception a contained murmur behind the glass doors. The spring night was cool, the sky overhead the pale dark of a city that never fully goes dark. "You look well," he said. And then, before she could answer, "I know how that sounds. Say whatever you need to say about it." "I don't need to say anything about it." She held his gaze. 5 years had not softened the specific quality of looking at this man. It still required a kind of bracing, a preparation, like a room where the pressure was slightly off. "You're here for Calloway's policy conversation. And you?" "The same." She let that sit for a moment. "We should probably have a conversation about how we handle being in the same rooms." "I'd say the same rooms are going to become more frequent," he said, "given what's happening. Dorian's consolidation, among other things." He looked at her with those gray eyes that had given nothing away for as long as she'd known them and were currently giving away more than she'd ever seen, quietly, in the specific way of someone who has been holding information with no one to give it to for a long time. "There's been a move. In the last 3 weeks, someone has been accessing the Succession archive." Her body was perfectly still. "Which section?" she said. "You know which section. I need you to say it." "The Aurelius Genealogical Registry," he said. "Someone has been requesting documents in that section through a proxy using authorization codes that trace back to a clerk in Prince Dorian's administrative staff." He paused. "They're looking for the same records you're looking for, and they are considerably less careful than you." She breathed, slow, felt the specific cold calculation of a timeline suddenly compressed. The work she had planned across 6 months collapsed into something much shorter. "How did you get this?" she asked. "I've had someone in the archive since your father died." "For 5 years?" "Yes." She studied him. This man who had been running a long, quiet operation in parallel with hers, from a northern estate, apparently with considerably more advanced knowledge than she'd credited him with. This man who had stood in the snow and told her she was in more danger than she knew, and then, instead of explaining it, had given her a horse and a letter and let her walk into the dark. "We need to talk," she said. "Not here. Not tonight." "No," he agreed. "Not tonight." He held her gaze for a moment longer than the conversation required. "I'm glad you're alive, Selene." The name, in his voice, in this context, after 5 years of it not existing anywhere in her daily life, she felt it land somewhere she hadn't prepared for it to land, and it took a deliberate act of internal organization to prevent that from showing in her face. "Lady Ashbourne," she said, until further notice. She walked back through the glass doors and into the noise and the light, and left him standing on the terrace. And she did not allow herself to think about his face for the rest of the evening, because she had work to do, and sentiment was a thing she had learned to carry in a sealed compartment where it couldn't get to anything load-bearing. She was 23 years old. She had a fortune, a network, and 5 years of preparation. She was 3 months from finishing what she'd come here to do, and someone had just started a race she couldn't afford to lose. Wilson. The letter came 4 days later. Not from Aldrich. She hadn't expected it from him. Not yet. Not until they'd had the conversation she'd postponed on Calloway's terrace. It came from Corvus, delivered by the specific courier arrangement they'd been using for 2 years, 3 intermediaries and a dead drop in the lower merchant quarter. Corvus's handwriting on the outside. Inside, a single line. They found the chest. They know what was in it. You have 72 hours before they know who you are. She read it standing at her dressing table in the gray morning light, still in the clothes she'd worn to a financial meeting the night before, and she understood with the clean, total clarity of someone whose calculation has just been proved exactly right, that the careful, patient, methodical timeline she had been running for 5 years had just become irrelevant. She had not been moving toward the moment. The moment had moved toward her. She crossed the room to her desk, opened the third drawer, retrieved the paper Aldrich had given her in the snow outside Ravenhurst Castle 5 years ago, the address in the capital she'd been told to use when she was ready. She looked at it for 3 seconds. She wrote a message in the shorthand she and Corvus had developed, sent it through the courier arrangement, and in the same breath wrote a second message to a different address. One of the 7 people in her network, the one whose specific knowledge covered the Imperial archive, and sent that through a different channel. Then she sat at her desk and did what she had always done when the ground moved. She assessed what was solid and what wasn't, and she built from what was solid. What was solid? The documents in the lining of the travel bag she had carried out of Ravenhurst 5 years ago, now stored in a location she alone knew. The financial position she had spent 5 years constructing. The network. The specific knowledge of how the fraud had been executed, which she had assembled piece by piece over 3 years of careful inquiry and now held in total. What wasn't solid? Her identity. Her timeline. And the unknown quantity of how much Aldrich Ravenhurst knew and what he intended to do with it, and whether the man who had once made the calculation that her best chance was to not know the truth was now going to make a different calculation or the same one again. There was a knock at the outer door. Too fast for the courier, too deliberate for the household staff. She was already standing when the door opened, and she was already looking at the face of the man she had not expected to see until she'd sent for him, standing in the frame of her study door in the gray morning light with the specific quality of urgency that she recognized, viscerally, as the same quality he'd had in the snow outside Ravenhurst Castle. The urgency of a man who has run out of calculated patience and arrived at raw necessity. "They've identified you," Aldrich said, "not as Seraphina Ashbourne, as Selene Vale." He stepped inside, closed the door behind him. "And there's something else." His eyes found hers across the room and held them with the full, unguarded weight of what he'd come to say. "The person who gave them your name, the person who has been feeding information about your identity, your network, your location for the past 6 months." He stopped. "Tell me," she said. "It's Corvus," he said. "Corvus Melm. He's been working for Dorian's people since before you arrived in the capital." He held her gaze. "Every piece of intelligence you've shared with him, every contact in your network that he knows about, every step of your timeline." A pause. "He sent them the message about the chest this morning, and then he sent them your address." The room was very quiet. Selene stood at her desk with the paper in her hand. Corvus's handwriting, the warning she'd taken as proof of loyalty, the single line that had felt like exactly the kind of information a trusted ally sends when the walls are closing in, and understood, with the cold precision of someone who has just watched the floor give out beneath the most load-bearing wall in the structure, that she had been running, for 5 years, inside a cage she'd helped build herself. The 72 hours were not a warning. They were a countdown someone had started after she was already inside the room. She didn't move for 3 seconds. Not paralysis, She'd trained herself out of paralysis in the first year in the capital, had understood early that the freeze response was a luxury that got people killed in environments that didn't pause while you processed. What she did instead was the thing she'd developed as a substitute, a complete, rapid internal audit of every decision she'd made in the past 5 years that had touched Corvus Meln, every piece of information she'd handed him believing it was going into a vault, every contact she'd named, every timeline she'd mapped out loud in his office over cold coffee while he nodded and made his precise, efficient notes. The audit took 3 seconds. The damage was catastrophic. "How certain are you?" she said. "Completely." Aldrich hadn't moved from the doorway. He was watching her with the attention of someone who is trying to determine how much of what he's seeing is shock and how much is the beginning of something else. "I have documentation. Payments from Dorian's Treasury Secretary to a holding company that Corvus controls under a different name. The first payment was 18 months before you arrived in the capital. 18 months before she arrived, which meant that whatever network Corvus had represented himself as running, the quiet infrastructure of people who had known her father's situation and chosen patience, had been compromised, or had never existed as he'd described it, before she'd walked through his door. She'd been recruited into a cage by a man who had looked at her across a column of figures she'd just corrected and said, "You have your mother's forehead," and she had taken that as the beginning of trust. She sat down, not because her legs gave out, because the alternative was standing in the middle of the room burning through energy she was going to need, and sitting was the faster way to get to the next calculation. She sat in the chair at her desk and put her hands flat on the surface and breathed. "The 7 people in my network," she said. "I don't know how many Corvus had access to. Some of them may be clean." A pause. "Some of them may not be." "The archive contact." "Almost certainly compromised. That's likely how they knew the chest had been opened. Your contact reported the inquiry." She looked at the letter in her hand. Corvus's single line. "They found the chest. They know what was in it. You have 72 hours before they know who you are." Not a warning, a staging mechanism. The kind of message designed to push a target into a predictable response, panic-driven activity, reaching out to known contacts, moving assets, all of it visible, all of it trackable, all of it exactly what Prince Dorian's people would need to map the full scope of what she'd built before they closed the net. She set the letter down. "What do they actually know?" she said. "Right now, as of this morning. They know Seraphina Ashbourne is Selene Vale. They know your father held documents from the Aurelius registry. They don't know yet whether you have those documents or where they are." He crossed the room, pulled the chair from the corner, and sat down across from her. Not at the desk, not in the formal arrangement of a meeting, just close enough that they were speaking at a human register rather than a cautious one. "That's the window. It's not large." "How did you find out about Corvus?" My man in the archive recognized the request pattern. The proxy request for the genealogical registry. He traced the authorization codes and they led to Dorian's treasury staff. When I started pulling that thread, Corvus's name appeared in the payment records. He was watching her face. "I came here directly." "You came here directly," she repeated, "before sending word, before using any of the contact channels." "Yes." "Why?" "Because I don't know which of your channels are clean," he said. "And because the fastest way to get this information to you was to walk through your door myself." She looked at him. This man, who had given her a horse and a letter and a direction in the snow, and then run his own quiet parallel operation for 5 years from a northern estate. This man who had, apparently, been accurate about the danger from the beginning and had chosen to manage it by keeping her ignorant of the specifics, and she had spent 5 years being furious at him for it. This man who was sitting across from her right now in the gray morning light with a specific quality of presence that she had never quite been able to dismiss, regardless of how inconvenient it was. She decided, in that moment, to trust him. Not because she had verified everything he'd told her. She hadn't, couldn't yet, didn't have time. But because the alternative was to trust nobody, and trusting nobody in a room where the walls were closing was just a slower way of dying. "I need 2 hours," she said. "And I need you to not be here when certain people arrive." "What people?" The kind that Dorian sends when 72 hours turns out to be a significantly shorter window than advertised. She was already standing, already moving to the inner door. Can you be somewhere that isn't this building for the next 4 hours? I can be wherever you need me. I need you at the address on the paper you gave me. She stopped at the door. I always had it, in case you wondered. Something crossed his face that she didn't have time to catalog. 4 hours, she said, and went through the door. She moved through the apartment with the efficiency of someone who had mentally rehearsed this specific scenario without believing she'd ever need to execute it. The documents from her father's chest were not in this apartment. She'd kept that discipline from the beginning, the understanding that the place where you lived was the first place that got searched, and the things that mattered most needed to be in a location that had no connection to your daily existence. The documents were in a rented room in the lower warehouse district, registered under a name she'd used once for a single financial transaction 3 years ago, and never again. What she needed from this apartment was less about objects and more about erasure. She spent 40 minutes destroying everything that documented the structure of her network. Not the people themselves, she couldn't protect that now, but the correspondence, the contact protocols. The operational notes she'd kept in a cipher she'd developed herself and kept in the back of a ledger that looked like routine trading house accounts. She burned it in the fireplace in the sitting room, feeding it in sections, watching the ash, making sure. She left the apartment wearing a coat she'd bought in the second year and never worn. Not a disguise, just different enough from her regular appearance to buy her the 30 seconds of visual recalibration that was sometimes all the margin available. She went down the back stairs, through the building's delivery entrance, into the morning city. The city was already running at full speed, indifferent to what was being decided in her chest. She moved south toward the warehouse district, taking 3 unnecessary turns. Not to lose surveillance, she was past believing she could avoid it entirely, but to establish whether she was being actively followed or passively monitored. The distinction mattered. Active following meant they were moving to acquire her now. Passive monitoring meant the net was closing, but not yet tightened, and she had the window Aldrich had described. It felt like passive monitoring. But she'd trusted her read of Corvus for 2 years and been completely wrong, so she held the assessment loosely and kept her pace even and unremarkable. The rented room in the warehouse district was on the 3rd floor of a building that stored imported textiles, accessed by an exterior staircase on the north face. She'd rented it through a property agent in the eastern quarter who dealt primarily in short-term commercial storage and had no reason to connect the room to her name or her person. She'd paid 2 years in advance. Cash. No name on the register. She climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, went inside. The room was 8 feet by 12. A single shelf along the west wall, a small window facing the canal. A locked box bolted to the floor under the shelf. She opened the box. The documents were there. The oilcloth they'd been wrapped in for 5 years, slightly darkened at the edges, but intact. The primary genealogical record with her father's annotations, the supporting materials, the miniature of her mother, face down in the corner of the box the way she'd placed it. She sat on the floor with the box open in front of her and did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She read the primary document slowly. Not for the information she'd already extracted from it, but for the shape of it. The complete shape, start to finish, every annotation, every notation in the margins, everything her father had spent the last decade of his life accumulating in the hidden room behind the bookcase in Ravenhurst Castle. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, she sat with the document in her lap and understood something she had been moving around for 5 years without looking at directly. The way you don't look at a light source because the looking costs you the sight you need to see everything else by. The record didn't just prove the current imperial line was fraudulent. It proved that the mechanism of the fraud, the specific series of events that had placed Caelius II's father on the throne 60 years ago, had required the active cooperation of at least 4 major noble houses. Houses whose current heads were still active in imperial politics. Houses whose contemporary representatives she had been navigating around for 3 years, treating as obstacles rather than as the actual architects of the crime she was trying to expose. One of those houses was Calloway. Duke Fenmore Calloway, whose spring reception she had attended 4 days ago, in whose room she had stood on the terrace and had her first direct conversation with Aldrich in 5 years. She looked at that for a moment. Then she looked at the second thing. The thing she'd always known was in the document, but had allowed herself to understand only partially, because full understanding required a kind of courage she'd been building toward rather than arriving at. Her mother's name in the Aurelius genealogical record was not evidence of a distant collateral connection to the original imperial bloodline. It was evidence of direct lineal descent. Her mother had been the last legitimate Aurelius heir in the primary line, which meant that Selene Vale was not a convenient political asset to be deployed in an argument about succession fraud. She was the actual heir, not one of several claimants, not a useful instrument in someone else's argument. The heir in the direct Aurelius succession, with documentation that properly presented before the Imperial Council under the original succession law that Callias I had never actually revoked, merely buried under 60 years of deliberately obscured legal precedent, would be impossible to dismiss. If it got to the council, if she were alive to present it, if the four noble houses who had built the current power structure on 60 years of fraud didn't have her killed before she reached the room. She wrapped the documents in the oilcloth, put them inside her coat against her body where she'd carried them the first time, locked the empty box, stood up. Chance. She got back to the address on Aldrich's paper, a set of rooms in a private residence in the upper commercial district, the kind of anonymous good address that meant money without meaning a name, in just under 4 hours. Her hand was on the door when she heard the voices inside. 2 voices. Not one. She stood with her hand on the door for 3 seconds, doing the audit, then opened it. Aldrich was standing near the window. The second person in the room was a woman she'd never seen in person, but whose face she had studied from a description provided by one of her network contacts 8 months ago. A face she recognized the way you recognize a face from a drawing, with the slight cognitive disorientation of reality aligning with representation. 40 years old, approximately. Dark coat. Hair pulled back with the specific no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had made a long time ago the decision that appearance was for people with time to spare. Selene, Aldrich said. This is Mira Tesseld, Selene said. The archivist. She looked at Aldrich. How? She came to me, he said. 6 months ago. She's been in the succession archive for 12 years. She knows where the alterations are. Selene looked at Mira Tesseld. What do you want? She said. The archivist returned her gaze with the directness of someone who had been waiting for a very specific question. The same thing your father wanted. The same thing he died trying to get close enough to do. She reached inside her coat and produced a folded document. Not old, recent, the paper clean and white. 3 weeks ago, Prince Dorian's staff made a request to the archive that required my personal authorization. The request was for the ledger of the original Imperial Legitimacy Review, the document that was altered 60 years ago to support the succession of Callias I. She held out the document. I authorized the request, but before I handed over the original, I made a copy of the relevant pages, including the alteration, including the notary seals of the 4 noble houses that witnessed and validated the fraud. Selene took the document, opened it, read it. Calloway, she said. Among others. She looked up. He hosted the reception 4 days ago. Half the Imperial Council was in that room. Yes, Mira said, because Dorian needed them all in one place to confirm their continued alignment before he moves on the succession question. The Emperor is dying. His household has been managing the information, but it's been 3 weeks and the Council already knows. She paused. Dorian is planning to move within the month. He needs the noble houses locked in before it becomes public. Selene stood in the middle of the room with the copy of the Altered Legitimacy Review in her hands, and her father's original documents against her ribs, and 5 years of careful construction demolished in a single morning, and did the only thing that had ever worked when everything else stopped. She looked at what was actually solid. The original documents, she said. The alteration copy. My mother's genealogical record. She looked at Aldrich. The documentary evidence is complete. It's getting it into a room that matters, he said. The Imperial Council session, Mira said. 3 weeks from now. Emergency session, formally convened. If someone was standing under the original succession law requests a legitimacy review, the Council is legally bound to hear it. She held Selene's gaze. The request has to come from someone who can prove direct standing in the Aurelius line. The room was very quiet. Me, Selene said. You. Aldrich was watching her from the window with those gray eyes that were currently doing none of the managed distance she'd spent 3 years cataloging and 5 years thinking about, just looking at her, fully, with whatever this man actually felt when the filters were down. 3 weeks is not long, he said. Dorian's people already know your identity. Calloway's people will know within hours that Mira has a copy of the alteration document. And there are 3 others beside Calloway whose entire current position rests on the fraud remaining buried. I know, Selene said. We'd need the council session formally requested before any of them can block it, and we'd need to keep you alive until it happens. A pause. That is not a small logistical problem. I know that too. She looked at him. But you've been managing the information around this situation for 18 years. You had a man in the archive for 5. You walked through my door this morning instead of sending a message because you understood that direct action was the only move left. She held his gaze. So I need to know something. What? All of it, she said. Everything you've been holding back. Every piece of information you've decided I was better off without. Every calculation you've made about what I could handle and when. I need all of it, right now. In this room. She put the alteration copy on the table between them. Because I am done operating in a version of this situation that someone else has edited for my protection. We have 3 weeks, and I need the complete picture, and I need it from you. But Aldrich looked at her for a long time. The archivist was watching them both with the careful neutrality of someone who understands she is in the room during something that was already in progress before she arrived. All right, Aldrich said. Then, sit down. This is going to take a while. She sat down. He pulled the chair across from her and sat down too, and for the first time in the 6 years she had known this man, across 11 formal conversations and one night in the snow in a terrace in spring, and this gray morning with the walls closing in, he opened his hands and put everything on the table. The first thing he told her she'd already known. The second thing she'd partially known. The third thing stopped her breath entirely. There were 3 children, he said quietly. Not 2. Your mother had 3 children before the attempt on her life. You. Your sister, who was taken east. He held her gaze without flinching. And a son, the oldest, born before either of you. He paused. He didn't go east. He stayed inside the empire. Your father spent 20 years protecting him from a distance, the same way he protected you, without letting either of you know the other existed. Another pause. He is currently in the capital. He has been in the capital for 2 years. Something in his face that she had no catalog entry for. You have already met him. The room went very still. Who? She said. Aldrich told her. And the name he said was the name of the man who had spent 2 years earning her trust and 18 months feeding her location and her network to the people who wanted her dead. And the name was Corvus Meln. And the silence that followed was not the silence of shock, but the silence of something breaking cleanly along a fracture line that had always been there. And Selene Vale sat in the gray morning light of a city that was already running at full speed in every direction, with 6 years of her life reorganizing itself around a single new fact, and understood that she had not been betrayed by a stranger. She had been betrayed by her own blood, and that changed everything about what she was willing to do next. She sat with the name for exactly 30 seconds. Not processing. She was past processing. The machinery of her thinking had shifted into something colder and more mechanical, the kind of function that operates when the emotional infrastructure has taken a hit too large to absorb in real time, and the body makes the executive decision to defer the full weight of it until survival is no longer the primary agenda item. 30 seconds of stillness while the room held its breath around her. Then she stood up. Where is he now? She said. Aldrich watched her with the specific attention of a man calculating structural load. His office, most likely. It's barely past 9. He doesn't know you came to me directly. No, he'll know soon. How soon? Within the hour, maybe less. Aldrich stood too. Selene, don't. She said it without heat, without drama. Just the flat factual delivery of someone who knows exactly what the other person is about to say and doesn't have the bandwidth for it right now. Don't tell me to process this carefully. Don't tell me what I'm feeling. I know what I'm feeling, and I know what it would cost me to act on it, and I'm not going to. She looked at him. What I need from you right now is tactical, not emotional. Can you give me that? Something in his face adjusted. Not hurt, not dismissed, more like a man who has been asked a question he didn't expect and is taking it seriously. Yes. Good. She looked at Mira Tesselt. The formal request for a legitimacy review. What does it require exactly? Not the legal theory. The specific practical steps. A written petition submitted to the Imperial Council Registrar, signed by the petitioner, citing the specific succession law under which standing is claimed. Mira's voice was precise. No wasted syllables. The registrar is legally required to acknowledge the petition within 24 hours and schedule a hearing date. Once acknowledged, the petition becomes part of the public imperial record and cannot be withdrawn or suppressed without a full council vote. Which would require assembling the council, Selene said, which takes 3 days minimum under imperial procedure. So once the petition is acknowledged, we have at least 3 days during which the hearing is scheduled, and on the record, and any attempt to suppress it is itself a public procedural act. She was already running the geometry. Who is the current registrar? Lord Vane Ashby. He's been in the position for 11 years. Mira paused. He's not one of them. I'd stake my career on it. His family has no connection to the 4 houses. I don't need his loyalty. I need his procedural compliance. She looked at Aldrich. The petition needs to be in Ashby's hands before Corvus understands what's happening, before Dorian's people can position themselves to intercept it. She paused. Which means we have approximately 40 minutes. Aldrich said nothing for a moment. You're going to file it today. I'm going to file it in the next 35 minutes. Without time to prepare. Without knowing the full scope of what Corvus has already handed them. Aldrich. She held his gaze. The preparation is done. 5 years of it. The documents are complete. The alteration copy is in my hand. She picked up Mira's document from the table. The only thing that running more preparation buys at this point is time for them to close the window. So yes, today. Now. She picked up her coat. Are you with me or not? He looked at her for one beat. I'm with you, he said. And the way he said it had none of the qualifications she'd been braced for. No but, no however, no careful subordinate clause of managed concern. Just the 2 words, delivered with the flatness of something that had already been decided some time ago and was only now finding the occasion to say itself out loud. She was already at the door. But the Imperial Council Registrar's office was in the administrative quarter, a 20-minute walk from Aldrich's rooms in normal conditions. They did it in 12, moving through the morning city at the pace of people with business rather than urgency. Urgency drew attention. Business was invisible. Mira came with them. Selene drafted the petition in her head as they walked, drawing on 3 years of legal research into imperial succession procedure, the specific statutes, the precise language required to invoke the legitimacy review clause. She had read the relevant sections so many times they had the flat, dimensionless quality of things known by heart rather than understood by mind. When they reached the administrative building, she sat in the anteroom outside Ashby's office and wrote it out in 7 minutes on paper provided by a baffled administrative clerk, longhand, precise, citing statute and subsection, and the specific genealogical evidence she was prepared to present. She signed it with her full name. Selene Aurelius Vale. Not Seraphina Ashbourne. Not the name she'd built over 5 years in this city. The name on the documents. The name her mother had written on the back of a painted miniature. The name that meant something specific under the succession law she was invoking and would mean nothing if she softened it with performance. The clerk took the petition into Ashby's office. They waited. Aldrich stood near the window. He didn't pace. She'd noticed that about him years ago, that he was a man who had made peace with stillness, who could inhabit a waiting period without filling it with visible anxiety. She had always found it either impressive or infuriating, depending on the day, and today it was both. 8 minutes. The clerk came back. Lord Ashby will see you. What that? Vane Ashby was 60 years old, narrow-shouldered, with the unhurried, deliberate manner of a man who had spent 4 decades in procedural law and had developed a near-religious conviction that the procedure was the point. He read the petition twice. Then he read it a third time, which told Selene he had understood it on the first pass and was using the second and third readings to decide what kind of moment he was in. He set it down. "The genealogical evidence you're citing," he said, "you have it in your physical possession." "Yes." "The alteration documentation for the original legitimacy review." He glanced at the copy Mira had provided, which Selene had attached to the petition. "This is authenticated." "My signature attests to its provenance," Mira said. "I can provide additional attestation from the archive if required." Ashby looked at Selene. "You understand what acknowledging this petition initiates." "I understand the procedure completely." "I'm not asking about the procedure." He held her gaze with the flat, assessing look of a man who has seen a great number of things done in the name of legal process and has learned to distinguish between people using the law and people serving it. "I'm asking whether you understand that acknowledging this petition will make you the single most targeted individual in the Empire by end of day." "Lord Ashby." She held his gaze. "My father died inside Ravenhurst Castle 12 years ago. He was targeted because he held evidence of exactly what this petition describes. I have been targeted under at least 2 different names for the past 5 years. The degree to which I am targeted is not going to improve with time, regardless of what you do with this document." She paused. "Acknowledge the petition. Let the procedure do what the procedure is designed to do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his seal. "What?" They were back on the street in 30 minutes. The acknowledgement receipt is in Selene's coat. The petition now formally part of the imperial public record and irrevocable without a full council assembly. Aldrich said nothing for half a block. Then, "They'll know within the hour." "Yes." "Dorian's people will move to block the hearing date." "They can't block it procedurally. They can only delay it with a council assembly. And assembling the council takes 3 days, and in 3 days I can get the original documents in front of enough council members independently that suppression becomes politically costly." She was thinking 3 moves ahead, which was the only way she knew how to walk through cities that were actively trying to kill her. "What I need is the next 18 hours. After that, the petition is anchored well enough that direct action against me becomes counterproductive. It turns martyrdom into evidence." "And before the next 18 hours?" "Before the next 18 hours, I am exactly as exposed as I was this morning." He nodded once, the nod of a man receiving a tactical assessment and integrating it without editorializing. She had always respected that about him, the absence of performative reaction, the way he took information in and processed it, and gave back only what was useful. They were crossing the market square when she heard the sound. Not dramatic, nothing dramatic about it, just the particular quality of movement that a crowd makes when something has changed at its center, a shift in the ambient noise and direction of foot traffic that her body registered before her mind did. She stopped. "Left," Aldrich said quietly. She didn't look left immediately. Looked at his face first, reading the assessment there. Controlled, alert, the specific configuration of a man who has identified a threat and is calibrating response. Then she looked left. 4 men at the edge of the square, dark wool, no insignia, standing with the particular stillness of people who have been waiting and have just received a signal. "Dorian moved faster than we thought," she said. "He had people in the administrative building." Aldrich's voice was flat, no wasted energy. "They saw us go in." "Can we reach your rooms?" "Not without going through them." A pause. "There's a passage off the south end of the square. Textile merchant, the building with the blue sign, goes through to the canal street." He said it the way he said most things, without performance, just factual, the information delivered as if it had always been available and she'd simply needed to ask. "Go, I'll be behind you." "Aldrich, go." She went. She didn't look back. That had become a discipline. The refusal to spend attention on what was behind her, when what mattered was what was ahead. She moved through the market square at a pace that was fast enough to cover ground and slow enough to not become a visible event, threading between stalls and the morning shoppers who had no idea what was happening 12 feet away from their unremarkable Tuesday. The textile merchant's building. Blue sign. She found the passage, not marked, not obvious, a gap between the building and the warehouse beside it, wide enough for a person moving sideways. She went through. The canal street on the other side was narrower, quieter, the morning traffic lighter. She pressed against the wall and waited. 30 seconds. 40. Aldrich came through the gap, moving faster than she'd ever seen him move, one hand against the wall, and she saw immediately the way his left arm was held, the angle of it, the controlled deliberateness of someone managing pain, that something was wrong. "How bad?" she said. "It's fine." "That's not what I asked." "I said it's fine." He looked at her. His breathing was controlled, but the control was the effortful kind, the kind that costs. "Left shoulder. It's not arterial. We need to move." She looked at his coat. Dark wool. You couldn't see it, but the way the fabric was sitting on the left side was wrong, weighted, and she could see at the collar line the beginning of something dark that was not the color of the coat. She thought of the 4 men at the edge of the square, the stillness of people who have been waiting for a signal, and understood what had happened in the 30 seconds between her going through the gap and him following. "There's a physician on Canal Street," Mira said. She'd appeared at the passage entrance, controlled and quiet. "Third building. She can be trusted." Selene looked at Aldrich. He returned the look with the specific, stubborn composure of a man who has decided he is not going to be the thing that slows them down and is communicating this with his entire body. "We don't have time for—" he started. "We have time for this," Selene said. And the way she said it ended the conversation. Not harshly, not with the heat of fear, just with the flat certainty of a woman who has spent 5 years learning the difference between what can be deferred and what cannot. The physician's name was Dr. Lena Harwick, and she had the rapid, unceremonious efficiency of someone who had been treating Canal District injuries for long enough that surprise was no longer part of her professional vocabulary. She looked at Aldrich's shoulder, looked at Selene, looked at the receipt in Selene's coat pocket because the edge of it was visible, and said nothing about any of it. She worked in silence. Selene stood by the window and watched the canal street while Harwick worked. The street was quiet. Either they hadn't followed through the passage or they were hanging back. The second option more likely, because Dorian's people were not going to make the mistake of creating a public incident while a formal petition was sitting in the public record. Public incidents created witnesses, and witnesses created the kind of messy procedural complications that interfered with the clean suppression of politically inconvenient information. They were going to wait for a private moment. She thought about Corvus. She allowed herself exactly that, to think about him, to hold the specific weight of what his name meant now, the reorganization of 2 years of trust and instruction, and the particular quality of his company, a man she had thought was the closest thing she'd found to someone who understood the full shape of what she was carrying. The way he'd said, "You have your mother's forehead," and she had taken that as recognition rather than what it actually was. Confirmation of identity, the moment a handler confirms that the asset has arrived. She understood that she had not been stupid. She had been operated on by someone with complete information and an 18-year head start on the deception. Knowing that didn't change the texture of it, the specific cold ugliness of understanding that the warmth she'd experienced in his company had been a performance executed with the kind of precision that required genuine skill. Her brother, who had chosen Dorian over blood, who had chosen the fraudulent throne over the legitimate one, presumably because the fraudulent throne was the one that was actually sitting on power. And power, she understood this, had made her peace with the fact that she understood it, was a more reliable foundation than legitimacy when legitimacy had been buried for 60 years. She did not hate him for the calculation. She hated him for the performance, for the forehead comment, for making it feel like recognition when it was surveillance. That distinction was the difference between something she could set aside and something that would need to be dealt with. Aldrich said something behind her and she turned. Harwick was finishing, wrapping the shoulder with the efficient wrapping of someone who has done this specific repair many times. Aldrich's face was pale under its usual composure, the pain visible in the set of his jaw rather than in any expression he permitted himself, and the sight of it did something to her chest that she categorized, filed, and moved away from because the timing was genuinely terrible. "You're going to need to rest this," Harwick said. "Thank you," Aldrich said, in a tone that did not commit to resting anything. Harwick looked at Selene. "Whoever did this is going to try again." "I know." "Then don't stand in Canal Street windows." She went back to her instruments without ceremony. Selene crossed to Aldrich, looked at him close range. He returned the look with the gray eyes that were currently doing the full unfiltered version. Not the managed distance, not the official register, just him, the real version, in a physician's back room in the Canal District, with a wrapped shoulder and blood on his collar, and the Empire actively trying to kill both of them. "The Grand Assembly," she said. "Calloway's going to convene it. When Dorian tells him the petition has been acknowledged, Calloway is going to move immediately to assemble the council and call a procedural suppression vote. Yes. Which means our 3-day window is probably 18 hours. Probably less." He paused. "I have 3 council members, people who owe me considerations that go back far enough to survive a suppression vote." He said it without drama, the way he delivered most things, as fact, available, and on the table. "If I reach them before Calloway does, I can hold the suppression vote long enough to get you to the floor. You reaching them means you moving through the city in the next 6 hours with a knife wound in your shoulder." "It means I'm moving through the city," he said. "The shoulder is a separate issue." She looked at him. She thought about the snow outside Ravenhurst Castle 6 years ago, the horse, and the letter, and the direction. She thought about a man running a quiet parallel operation for 5 years from the north, a man in the archive, 18 months of documented payments, walking through her door at 9 in the morning because direct action was the only move left. She thought about him on the terrace at Calloway's reception, saying, "I'm glad you're alive," with exactly enough of his guard down that she'd had no catalog entry for it. She thought about what it cost a man like this to be right about something terrible for a very long time and not be able to say so, and what it did to the inside of a person to hold that weight in the specific silence of someone who has decided that protection requires distance. 3 council members, she said. 3 confirmed, possibly a 4th, but I'd need to speak with him directly. "Then you need to move in the next 2 hours. She held his gaze. "Go. I'll handle the documents and get to the assembly chamber ahead of schedule. You're not going anywhere alone. Mira will be with me." Mira is an archivist. Mira got those documents out of the Imperial Archive under Dorian's direct observation. I think she can handle a walk to the assembly chamber. She took 1 step closer to him, the same step she'd taken in the East study 6 years ago, closing the distance by 1 precise degree. "Aldrich, I need those council members, and I need you operational enough to reach them. So I need you to trust me with my own part of this." He looked at her for a long moment. "When this is over," he said, "there are things I need to say to you." "I know. I've been—" He stopped, started differently. "I made decisions, for years, that I made without your consent because I told myself they were protective, and they were, but they were also—" Another stop. "They were also easier for me than having this conversation." She looked at him. This man who had been carrying the same terrible knowledge as her father for 18 years, and had chosen to carry it alone, and had been wrong about the carrying but not wrong about the weight of it, and felt the full force of what it meant that he was saying this here, in a physician's back room, with blood on his collar, and 2 hours before everything fell apart or came together. "We'll have that conversation," she said. "After." "After," he agreed. She put her hand on his arm. The good arm, brief, deliberate, the kind of touch that says, "I hear you," and "not yet," and "stay alive" all at once without requiring any of it to be spoken. Then she stepped back and picked up her coat. 2 hours, she said. "Assembly chamber east entrance. Don't be late." She walked out the door into the canal street with Mira behind her, and the morning city around her, and the petition in her pocket, and her mother's documents against her ribs. And somewhere in the city ahead of her, the assembly chamber was already filling with the particular political heat of a moment that had been building for 60 years and was finally, irrevocably, about to break. She was moving through the lower commercial district 2 blocks from the assembly building when she heard the crowd. Not ahead of her. Ahead would have meant the chamber, normal assembly traffic, the managed business of imperial procedure. The crowd was to her right, toward the main plaza, growing louder with the specific quality of noise that a large group makes when something unscheduled has happened at its center. She stopped. Mira stopped beside her. "That's coming from the plaza," Mira said. "Yes. The assembly doesn't open for another 4 hours." Selene looked at the noise, at the direction of the foot traffic that was beginning to redirect itself toward the plaza, at the expressions on the faces of the people moving, not panic, not quite, but the excited animal alertness of a city that has just received information it wasn't expecting. She stopped a man moving past her. "What's happening in the plaza?" He looked at her with the distracted urgency of someone who knows something and is enjoying knowing it. "They're saying the Emperor is dead, an hour ago. The announcement just went up." He moved on. Selene stood very still. The Emperor was dead, 1 hour ago. And the petition was in the public record as of 40 minutes ago. And Dorian had been consolidating noble house alignments for months in preparation for exactly this moment. And Corvus, her brother, the word still strange and terrible in her mind, had been feeding Dorian's people her location and her network for 18 months, which meant Dorian had known, or suspected, that a legitimacy challenge was coming and had been positioning for it before it arrived. She looked at Mira. "He was waiting," she said. "Not consolidating in preparation for when the Emperor died. Consolidating in preparation for when I moved." She heard her own voice working through it in real time. "Corvus told him I had the documents. Dorian has known for months that a legitimacy challenge was coming. Everything he's done since, every noble house alignment, every council relationship, has been infrastructure for suppressing a challenge that he knew was coming from me specifically." "Which means he's been ready for this," Mira said. Quiet, precise. "Which means the 3 council members Aldrich is moving to secure right now have already been contacted by Dorian's people." She looked at the crowd moving toward the plaza. The moment the death announcement went up, Dorian's people started working his list. Aldrich is walking into an outreach effort that's been running for hours ahead of him. The Assembly Chamber East entrance was 1 block ahead. She looked at it. She thought about what it meant to walk into that chamber now, in this moment, with the petition on the record and the Emperor dead, and the Empire already reorganizing itself around the succession question, with every powerful person in the capital simultaneously receiving the same information and making the same calculation about which side of this to be on. She thought about what her father had done with the same information for 18 years. The hidden room, the locked chest, the letter written knowing he was already dying, the careful instructions, the love disguised as logistics, the 20 years of waiting for the right moment that had never come, because the right moment is not a thing that arrives. It is a thing that gets made, by people willing to pay the cost of making it. She had the documents. She had the petition on the record. She had a man with a knife wound working his way through a city that was already running the new calculation. And she had approximately 6 minutes before the assembly chamber filled with every person in the capital who had just heard that the Emperor was dead, including the people who had been waiting 18 years to make sure the wrong name went on the throne. She looked at the east entrance. She looked at Mira. "Walk fast," she said. They were 30 feet from the entrance when the doors opened from the inside and the man who stepped out of them stopped her in her tracks the way a wall stops you. Suddenly, completely, with the full shock of a physical fact. Corvus Meln. Her brother, who had spent 2 years performing loyalty. Standing in the entrance of the assembly chamber with 2 men behind him and the specific expression of someone who has been waiting at exactly this location for exactly this arrival, and was now experiencing the particular quality of a plan that has arrived at its final step. He looked at her. She looked at him. She looked at his face. This face she had studied for 2 years across office desks and financial ledgers. This face she had trusted with the shape of everything she was building. This face that had said, "You have your mother's forehead in a November morning," and she had taken it as the beginning of something instead of the end, and looked for her mother in it, the way she'd spent 2 years not knowing to look. She found her. The forehead, yes, but also the set of the jaw. The eyes, not the color, but the quality of the attention in them. The precise cataloging attention of someone who has learned that observation is the primary tool. Her mother's attention, behind her brother's face, aimed at her across 30 feet of Imperial Plaza stone. "Selene," he said. His voice was the same. That was the worst part. After everything, after the accounting of what he'd done and what it had cost her, his voice was exactly the voice she remembered from 2 years of mornings in his office, and her body reacted to it before her mind could manage the response. "I know everything," she said. "I know you do." He didn't move. Neither did the men behind him. "That's why I'm here." Something in his face, not guilt. She wasn't going to call it guilt. She wasn't going to give him that. Something more complicated and more human. The expression of a man who has been doing a thing for a long time and has just arrived at the place where the doing of it becomes undeniable even to himself. "I need you to hear something before you go in there." "You have nothing to say that Dorian has Aldrich." The plaza noise continued around them, the city alive and indifferent. Somewhere in the distance, the crowd at the plaza was still processing the announcement of the Emperor's death. She stood very still. "He was picked up 20 minutes ago," Corvus said. "His 3 council contacts were already secured. Dorian's people were waiting." He held her gaze. "He's being held in the chamber's lower administrative wing, and the condition for his release—" A pause, the complicated expression deepening. "The condition is you." The morning light was flat and gray and equal across everything. She looked at her brother. She looked at the assembly chamber entrance behind him. She looked at the petition in her pocket, the documents against her ribs, the 20 years of her father's careful work and her mother's sacrifice, and 5 years of her own construction, all converging on this one specific moment, this door, this choice, this chambered political machinery that was either going to validate everything or be the place where all of it ended. She looked at Corvus Meln's face, her mother's jaw and eyes in a man who had chosen the wrong side and was standing in her way, and understood with the cold, total clarity of someone who has run out of deferred reckonings that she had arrived, finally and completely, at the moment her father's letter had been written toward. You will need to decide what kind of person you are going to become. Her next move would answer that question for everyone watching and for herself, and for whatever version of her father still existed in the weight she'd been carrying since a winter morning 6 years ago, when she'd woken to the sound of her own name being spoken through a wall. She took one step forward. She took one step forward and stopped. Not because of the men behind Corvus, not because of the weight of what was in her coat or the petition in her pocket or the assembly chamber doors standing open behind him like a mouth that had already decided what it was going to say. She stopped because she was looking at her brother's face, and she was looking at it the way she looked at everything that mattered, completely, without the buffer of the story she wanted it to tell. And what she saw there was not the clean architecture of an enemy. It was worse than that. It was a man who had made a terrible choice, and knew it, and was standing in front of her anyway, which was either the beginning of something or the last performance of a very long deception, and she did not have the luxury of time to determine which. "How long?" she said. He knew what she was asking. "Since before you arrived. Dorian's people found me 8 months before you came to the capital. They already knew about my mother, about the bloodline." He held her gaze. The men behind him were still. "They offered me a position, security. The kind of life that—" He stopped. Started differently. "I'd spent 30 years as nobody, Selene. I didn't have your father. I didn't have Ravenhurst. I had the people who took me east in a name that wasn't mine and no history that belonged to me." Something moved through his face, not asking for sympathy. He wasn't built that way, but acknowledging the fact of his own history the way a man acknowledges a scar. "Dorian offered me something real. He offered you a position serving a fraudulent throne," she said, "built on the murder of our family. He offered me existence, flat, final." The specific tone of someone who has had this argument with themselves for long enough that the words have worn smooth. "You can call it what you want. I know what it was. I also know what the alternative was." The plaza noise moved around them, the city going about its Tuesday with no idea what was being decided on this particular piece of stone. Mira stood very still behind her right shoulder. Selene could feel the weight of the chamber behind Corvus, the assembly already filling, the succession already in motion, The 60-year machinery of a fraudulent empire grinding toward the moment it would either correct itself or bury the correction permanently. "Where is he?" she said. "Lower administrative wing, east corridor, third room." He held her gaze. "The condition isn't negotiable. You walk away from the chamber today, they release him. You go in there." "I heard the condition." She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been doing since she was 18 years old and had learned that looking was the primary tool, the thing that worked when everything else had been taken away. "I want to know if you believe it, that I would walk away." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't believe it." "Then why are you standing here?" Another moment, longer, the complicated expression deepening into something she didn't have a catalog entry for, had never had one, because she'd never known to look for it. The expression of a man who has arrived at the edge of his own calculation and found that the edge is not where he expected it to be. "Because I wanted to see your face when you decided," he said quietly. "I wanted to see what you'd do." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about their mother, the woman in the miniature, Elara Aurelius Vale, the last, who had survived an attempt on her life and made a decision so brutal and so loving simultaneously that Selene had spent 6 years unable to hold both qualities of it at once. The decision to scatter her children across the empire and let the world believe they were dead, to protect them by making them into absences. She thought about what it meant to be the child that absence had landed on, what it had made of Corvus, 30 years of being a person with no history that belonged to him. What it had made of her, 18 years of being a person with a history that turned out to be a lie. She thought about her father's letter. "You will need to decide what kind of person you're going to become." She had been deciding for 6 years. She was still deciding here, on this stone, with her brother in front of her, and the chamber behind him, and Aldrich, somewhere in the lower administrative wing, held on a condition she was not going to meet. "Move," she said. Corvus didn't move. "I'm not asking again," she said. "Not with heat." Heat was for people who needed the other person to know they were serious. She didn't need him to know anything. She just needed him to make a choice. "You came here to watch me decide. You have your answer. Now you need to make yours." The men behind him shifted. Corvus looked at her for a long moment with their mother's eyes, and whatever calculation he was running behind them arrived at its conclusion in the specific way that large calculations arrive, not with fanfare, but with the quiet internal click of a thing that has been working toward a resolution finding it. He stepped aside. She walked through the door. Yent. The assembly chamber was already half full and running at the particular pitch of a room that has received enormous news and is simultaneously trying to process it and perform the processing for everyone else present. The emperor was dead. An hour old, the fact of it, and already the room was reorganizing itself around the new topology. Who stood near whom, who had moved to the center, and who had retreated to the walls, the silent cartography of power reassessing itself in real time. She walked in with Mira behind her and the documents against her ribs, and stood for a moment just inside the entrance, letting the room see her. Several people recognized Seraphina Ashbourne. 3 of them showed visible surprise at her presence. 2 of them, council members she had met at various social functions over 3 years, showed something else, a more complex reaction, and she filed that under potentially useful and moved on. She found Vane Ashby near the registrar's table at the north end of the chamber, already working, already managing the procedural cascade that a succession crisis triggers. He looked up when she approached, saw her face, saw the specific quality of her presence in the room. "The petition," he said, "is acknowledged and on the record," she said. "I need 5 minutes at the floor." "Lady," he stopped. Recalibrated. "The floor is not formally open. The session hasn't been called to order." "Then call it to order." He looked at her. He looked at the room behind her, the half-assembled council, the rising noise of a body that was moving toward emergency session anyway, because the emperor was dead and someone had to say something official about what happened next. He looked back at her with the flat procedural gaze of a man who has spent 4 decades in this room and understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the procedure was not separate from the moment. It was the moment, the only tool a civilized body had for managing the kinds of forces that otherwise expressed themselves in blood. He picked up the session bell. The room went quiet. "All right," She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not perform it. She had written and rewritten this speech in her head for 3 years, had imagined it in a dozen different registers, passionate, precise, prosecutorial, and standing on the assembly floor with the council ranged before her, and the documents in her hands, she used none of those registers. She used the same voice she used for everything that mattered, the flat, clear, fully inhabited voice of a person telling the truth without decoration. She laid out the fraud, the original alteration of the succession record 60 years ago, the 4 noble houses, the murder of Cassius Vale, the death of her father, the genealogical documentation of the Aurelius line, Mira's authenticated copy of the altered legitimacy review, the specific statutes under which the petition had been filed and under which the council was legally bound to hear it. She did not accuse Dorian directly. She presented evidence and cited law and let the room do the work. Calloway tried to interrupt 3 times. Ashby denied him 3 times on procedural grounds, with the serene, implacable courtesy of a man who has been waiting his entire career for a moment this clean and is not going to let someone dirty it up with bad manners. When she finished, she set the documents on the registrar's table and stepped back. The chamber was very quiet. Then it was very loud. She found Aldrich in the lower administrative wing 40 minutes later, in the east corridor, 3rd room, which was unlocked and unguarded. Because somewhere in the preceding 40 minutes, Dorian's people had made the calculation that holding a Duke of the Realm in an assembly chamber basement on the day a legitimacy petition hit the floor was a liability that outweighed whatever leverage they'd imagined it represented. He was sitting on a bench along the wall, coat off, the wrapped shoulder visible, and he looked up when she opened the door with the specific expression of a man who has been sitting in a locked room doing the kind of thinking that you can only do when there is nothing else available to do. She stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. He absorbed that. Dorian is currently answering questions from 6 council members in the main chamber with no noble house support because Calloway's people read the room fast enough to withdraw their alignment before the vote. She paused. Calloway himself left through the north entrance about 20 minutes ago. I don't think we'll be seeing him at social functions for a while. Something moved through Aldrich's face. Not satisfaction exactly, more the quality of a long tension finally finding a place to release. He stood, and the movement cost him something visible, and she crossed the room without deciding to. She put her hand against the side of his face. He went completely still. Not startled. The stillness of someone receiving something they had stopped expecting. His eyes found hers at close range and held them with the full unguarded weight of a man who has run out of careful distance and is, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, simply present. "You said there were things you needed to tell me," she said. "Yes." "Tell me now." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel his jaw working slightly under her palm, the specific movement of a man choosing his words not for performance but for accuracy, which she had always respected about him, and which now, in this room, in this quiet, felt like the most intimate thing she'd ever witnessed. "I made decisions that weren't mine to make," he said. "For 18 years I held information that belonged to you, and I held it because I told myself that knowing it would put you in danger, and that was true, but it was also—" He stopped, the gray eyes steady. "It was also easier, carrying it alone, than having to look at you and account for it." She said nothing. "When you were 18 and sitting across from me in the East Study," he continued, "I knew exactly what you were carrying, and I sent you out into the snow with a horse and a letter, and told myself I was protecting you. And I was. And it was also the most cowardly thing I have ever done in my life. And I have spent 6 years knowing both of those things simultaneously and not knowing what to do with the second one." She looked at him. She thought about what it cost a person to say that, not the confession of a dramatic failing, not the theatrical self-flagellation that powerful men sometimes performed when they wanted the appearance of accountability without the weight of it. This was the other kind, the quiet, precise acknowledgement of a specific thing done and the specific cost it carried, offered without expectation of what she would do with it. She had spent 6 years building a structure of careful distance from this man, had built it deliberately, brick by brick, with the full understanding that distance was the only thing that kept certain kinds of feeling from becoming operational liabilities. She had been correct about that. She had also been, she understood now, in this small room in the lower administrative wing, doing the same thing she was accusing him of, carrying it alone. Because alone was easier than having to look at someone and account for it. "I know," she said, "and I spent 6 years being furious at you for the cowardice and not acknowledging that I was doing the exact same thing in the exact same direction." She held his gaze. "So we're even on that." Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical release of a man arriving at relief. Just a quiet shift, like light changing in a room when a cloud moves, the same room differently inhabited. "Selene," he said. "Still here," she said. He reached up with his good hand and covered the hand she still had against his jaw. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple, because nothing real ever is. Dorian was removed from the succession by council vote on the 3rd day after the assembly session, the vote carrying by a margin that would have been impossible 6 months ago and was possible now because the evidence was undeniable and because men who have spent their careers calculating which side of history to stand on had made their calculations, and the evidence had been persuasive. He did not go quietly. There was a period of political noise, legal challenges, a formal counterpetition from 2 of the 4 implicated noble houses, all of which moved through the procedural machinery that Ashby managed with the serene implacability of a man in his element. The 4 houses were formally censured by imperial council order. Calloway surrendered his seat voluntarily on the 6th day, which was widely understood as an acknowledgement that the alternative was worse. The other 3 took longer and cost more political capital to manage, but they fell, one by one, with the specific inevitability of structures built on fraudulent foundations, encountering the weight of time. Selene did not move quickly toward the coronation. She had not come here for a crown. She had come here because her father had died inside a northern castle with a secret that needed to see daylight, and that work was done. And what came after it was something she approached with the same deliberate care she had applied to every stage of the previous 6 years. She convened working groups. She read law. She spent 3 weeks in conversation with Mira Tesselt about the specific mechanisms by which the succession fraud had been maintained, not to understand the past, but to understand what structural changes would prevent it from recurring. She visited Corvus once. He was being held in the council's administrative custody. Not imprisoned, the situation was more complicated than that. The question of what to do with a man who was simultaneously an imperial heir and an agent of the deposed claimant sitting with the council's legal committee in the way that genuinely novel situations sit, slowly, with a great deal of argument. She went to see him alone, over the objection of 3 different advisors who had very reasonable concerns about the security implications. He looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who has had a great deal of time to sit alone with what he'd done and has not found the sitting comfortable. She sat across from him. "I'm not here to prosecute you," she said. "The legal committee is handling that." "Then why?" "Because you're my brother." She said it plainly, without drama, as a fact she had decided to hold rather than a sentiment she was performing. "And because I want you to understand something that I don't think anyone else is going to tell you." He was quiet. "What you did was wrong," she said. "Not morally complicated. I know it felt complicated. I know the circumstances were real and the desperation was real, and none of that makes it not wrong. You chose a fraudulent throne over your family's blood. You fed information to people who wanted me dead." She held his gaze. "I am not going to pretend otherwise or soften it for you." He said nothing. His jaw was set, his mother's jaw, their mother's jaw, and the resemblance was still strange and still somehow essential, the proof of something that couldn't be undone regardless of what he'd done. "I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life treating you as a category instead of a person," she said. "You made a choice. You're going to live with its consequences. And after that," she paused, "after that is something we'll figure out as it comes." He looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about it. "Because our mother scattered us to protect us," she said. "And that worked. We're both alive. And I am not going to let what you did with that life be the last word on what the 3 of us—" She stopped, corrected herself. "The 4 of us were. Because there's still your sister out east. Our sister. She let that sit. Our mother paid a price I can't even hold completely in my mind. I'm not going to waste what she bought. He dropped his eyes. She left without saying anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying, and she had learned, was still learning, that the most powerful endings were the ones that didn't try to resolve everything, that left room for the slow work of time. Wamsi. The coronation was held in the 48th year of an empire that had just discovered it had been lying to itself for 60, on a morning in late autumn when the sky over the capital was the clean-washed gray of a city after rain. She wore no ceremonial armor, no elaborate genealogical display. She had argued for 2 weeks with the council's ceremonial committee about this, and won, which had cost her some political goodwill and which she had decided was worth the cost because the first thing a new reign communicates is what it considers important, and she was not going to begin hers with theater. She wore the Aurelius colors, dark blue, old gold, and the genealogical documentation was read into the record by Ashby in his measured procedural voice. And she stood before the assembled council and the public gallery and whatever the empire was about to become, and was present for all of it, fully, without the managed distance she had spent 6 years learning to inhabit. Afterward, she walked out into the public courtyard because she had insisted on that too, that the first thing after the formal proceeding was not a private reception for council members, but 15 minutes in the courtyard, open, visible, the kind of availability that a ruler who intends to govern differently from her predecessors demonstrates before she demonstrates anything else. Aldrich was waiting near the east wall. Not in the official position, she'd had a careful conversation with the council's protocol committee about that, about what his presence meant formally and what it didn't need to mean yet. He was simply there, standing near the wall with his coat buttoned against the autumn cold, the shoulder healed now, watching her move through the courtyard with the expression she had spent 6 years cataloging and had finally, in the lower administrative wing of the assembly building, understood correctly. Not contempt. Never contempt. The expression of a man who had been watching someone he could not yet say something to, and had been doing it for a very long time, and had learned to make the watching look like distance because the alternative required a conversation he didn't know how to begin. She crossed the courtyard to him. He watched her come with those gray eyes that had given her nothing for 6 years, and were currently giving her everything, quietly, in the way of someone who has put down a weight they've been carrying long enough that the putting down is a physical event, visible in the set of the shoulders, the quality of the stillness. "Well?" he said. "Well," she agreed. He looked at her. The courtyard noise moved around them, officials, attendants, the managed ceremony of the thing they'd just done. None of it touched where they were standing. "I have spent 18 years," he said, "making decisions about your life based on what I thought you needed to not know. And then 6 years watching you dismantle everything I thought I was protecting and build something better with the pieces." He paused. "I don't know if an apology covers 18 years. "It doesn't," she said, "but it's a start." Something in his face, the ghost of what might have been, across a different 18 years, a different set of choices. "I want to earn what comes after it, not be forgiven for the past. Earn what comes after it." His voice was low. The flat delivery she had known in 11 conversations and a snow-covered yard and a physician's back room and a locked room in the lower administrative wing, all the way down to what it actually was underneath. A man who had taught himself to speak carefully because careless speaking had always seemed to him like a form of disrespect for the weight of what was being said. "I don't know what that looks like. I think we figure it out." She looked at him. She thought about 18 years old and 12 degrees below and the iron sound of gates closing. She thought about what she had built in the years since. Not the fortune, not the network, not the political architecture of the past weeks. The internal thing. The part of her that had walked out into the dark and refused to look back, that had arrived in a city with nothing and made something out of nothing because the alternative was dying of someone else's decision. The part that knew, with the hard-earned certainty of someone who had tested it in every condition available, that she did not need to be saved. The part that could, because of exactly that, choose to stand next to someone without it meaning she required them. "We figure it out," she said. She offered him her hand. Not the formal gesture of ceremony. She'd had enough ceremony for one morning. Just her hand, open, The way you offer a hand to someone you're inviting to walk with you. He looked at it. He took it. The courtyard went about its business around them, the empire beginning the slow, complicated work of becoming something better than it had been. And the girl who had been cast out of a castle in the worst winter in decades stood in the autumn light and held the hand of the man who had put her in the snow and spent 6 years trying to make it right, and understood finally and completely what her father had meant. Not the secret, not the bloodline, not the documents or the petition or the council vote. The other thing, the last line of the letter, the one she'd read standing in the hidden room behind a bookcase in a dead man's study, the one she'd carried in her body for 6 years like a coal kept burning against the cold. Then you will need to decide what kind of person you are going to become. She had decided. Not once, not in a single heroic moment, not in the assembly chamber or the courtyard or the physician's back room. She had decided the way real things get decided, incrementally, under pressure, in the ordinary moments between the extraordinary ones, in every choice to keep moving instead of stopping, in every refusal to let the bitterness calcify into the kind of hardness that protects you by killing the parts of you worth protecting. In every moment she had looked at the person in front of her and chosen to see them completely, rather than conveniently. The castle that had cast her out was, as of this morning, hers. She did not intend to run it the way it had been run. The empire that had tried to erase her bloodline for 60 years was, as of this morning, in the process of being rebuilt. She did not intend to rebuild it in the image of what it had been. And the man standing next to her, holding her hand in an autumn courtyard, with the careful, costly presence of someone who had learned the difference between protecting people and trusting them. This man was not a prize, not a reward, not the happy ending that resolved the story. He was the person she had chosen, with full information, at full cost, after 6 years of deciding whether trust was a thing she could afford. She could afford it. Not because the danger was over. It wasn't, not entirely, not yet. Not because the work was finished. It wasn't, it was barely beginning. But because she had learned in the years between a postern gate and a coronation courtyard that safety was not a condition that existed prior to trust. It was a condition that trust created, slowly, in the space between two people willing to do the difficult thing of being honest with each other. She had done harder things. The autumn light was flat and clean and equal across everything. They walked.